Namaste and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you all today and to our larger audience today on YouTube. Welcome to everyone. I'm Vasudha Narayanan from the Department of Religion and the Director for the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions, Chitra for short. It's been a pleasure to be here for the last 2 days, for the last day and a half, with John Guy from the Met, and I'll introduce him soon. Chitra was started in 2005, and we wanted to promote research, teaching, and the public understanding of Hinduism, and we have a large outreach program. We also have several units connected with it, uh, different units, one on the Gujarat Studies program, and our talk today falls under that. We have a general Chitra fund and also a classical studies fund, music fund. More important, recently we have started Sri Kanji Swami Jainism Fund to promote the teachings of the Jain tradition. Um, we are delighted to have had this program, the inaugural lecture, in Doctors Kiran and Pallavi Patel, Endowed lectures. It's through their exemplary generosity that we've had the opportunity to have wonderful speakers like John Guy today. We've had the privilege of partnering with the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art several times in the last few years, and I want to thank the museum, particularly Eric, for reaching out and helping us so much today to make the arrangements. Dave Richardson from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences will welcome you all and say a few words about the program itself. Dean Rich, David Richardson is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and professor in the Department of Chemistry, where he was also chair for many years. He was appointed Dean in 2015 after serving as the interim Dean since 2014. He received his PhD in chemistry from Stanford University in 1981, was the NIH postdoc associate in Stanford and MIT before he came here in 1983. That's about a year after I came. We've been very fortunate and very grateful to have had his sustained support for the humanities in these difficult times, and we're honored to have you with us today.
Good afternoon. It is terrific to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Vasu, to welcome all those who are joining us both here live in the auditorium as well as those online on behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, faculty, students, and staff of the college. I would also like to extend my thanks to Harn for serving as such a wonderful host here for this talk, and of course for their many collaborations with our college over some time. The talk today was very interesting to me, as is the history of our speaker, John Guy, and I look forward to hearing what he's going to talk about. There are a couple of things that struck me from his background. I'm sure that we'll hear more about his background, but two things. First, he was a curator at the Auditorium Albert for 22 years. I can only conclude, as an enthusiastic and extraordinarily impressed visitor to the Auditorium Albert, that must have been an incredible period of time in the museum's history. Its history is, of course, much longer than any of our lives, and it is truly a shining jewel of the museum world. I will also say that the Metropolitan is a shining jewel as well, and so I'm pleased that he has brought his talents to that job. The other thing that has impressed me very much in reading about John Guy is at one point he was called a detective across the centuries. I very much enjoyed that. I thought that that was just kind of captured exactly what a curator does, in my estimation. But it also reflects so much on what any scholar does. We are, in effect, detectives trying to understand the world around us, trying to tease apart the facts, the realities, the timelines in our world, in our universe. And I've never been called a detective of chemistry, but if I had been, I would have accepted that readily as a good description of what scientists do in general. So again, thank you very much. I'll also close by thanking the Patels for their generosity to support this series and these wonderful events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Richardson. It's my pleasure and a privilege to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon, John Guy. John Guy is the Florence and Herbert Irving Curator of the Arts of South Asia and Southeast Asia at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And he's an elected fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences here. He is formerly served as a senior curator of South Asian art at the Victoria and Albert Museum, as our dean said, and it's a wonderful, wonderful collection, and I've enjoyed it many times, as we have at the Met. And I think we were there for 24 years, give or take. Uh-huh. He has worked on a number of archaeological excavations, including maritime sites, and served as an advisor to UNESCO on historical sites in Southeast Asia. And although he's written many big, I say although, he has edited and written many books and articles, really impressive ones, and has curated really large shows at the Met. And we have them all listed in the bio that was sent out to you. And when I asked him, what is it that you really are happy with? What do you take pleasure in doing? And of course, apart from playing the detective and finding out more and more and everything, he said that the true areas that he's really happiest about is working with shipwreck archaeology. And in fact, I think he's been very modest about it, but he created the field, that whole area of shipwreck archaeology, and written extensively about it. And also in working with UNESCO heritage sites. He spent several weeks and quite a lot of time in Champasak in Laos, working with the Linga Parvat mountain and the early Khmer temples there and artifacts. And he has worked extensively with those. Among his many curated exhibits, and one really big one is coming up in 2023 on early Buddhism in India, focusing on the Deccan and so on. Among the earlier ones, he's co curated one with the Los Angeles Museum on the Chola sacred bronzes of southern India. And my favorite one, which I didn't get to see, but which now I have the catalog for, is on Lost Kingdoms, which focused on early Khmer, Thai, as well as, and they had about 110 pieces, huge pieces, loaned from those countries. Quite a feat, not just to get them there, to have the trust of those governments to get them here, but also to raise the funds for all of that. He's quite a scholar, and read many of his articles and books. And he is the quintessential detective in all of them. And having studied a particular topic for many years, I read those articles and I always come back saying, I didn't know that. And oh, that was insightful. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being here for the inaugural lecture of Kiran and Doctors Kiran and Pallavi Patel lecture series. And John Guy's talk today will focus on Gujarat, which is what the lecture series is for. And another patron of Gujarat Studies, Dr. Dinesh Oshya, was supposed to have been here, but he's not yet here, and because of uh, his immuno status, we're not sure whether he'll make it, but he extends his greetings to you as well. Thank you.
Okay. Getting feedback, we're okay. Okay, so thank you ever so much. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Vasu. It's a great pleasure to be here, an honor to be giving the inaugural Patel lecture. So I thank the Professor Narayanan for the honor to be invited to present the inaugural Kiran and Pallavi Patel lecture in Gujarati Studies and the Roy Craven Jr. Memorial Lecture here at the Harn Museum at University of Florida. Together, also extend thanks to Professor Dinesh Shah, who I understand has been very supportive of these activities. Of course, this lecture also takes place under the auspices of the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions, the brainchild of Vasu, known to all of us. Chitra is emerging as an important center for the study of South Asian Hindu traditions here and across the US. So I was invited to give this lecture, and it was suggested that I would keep it a broad canvas, that there are people with a range of backgrounds and interests, and so I've taken the brief at its word and want to present to you the big picture, if you like, of Gujarat over the last 2,000 years, but focusing principally on the first half of that period, the first millennium, which is my natural comfort zone, really, historically speaking. So Gujarat has played a key role in India's engagement with the wider world since antiquity. The weaving and dyeing of cotton and silk textiles, the extraction and processing of gemstones, temples, shrines, mosque architecture, mastery of shipbuilding, of course, navigational skills, the accumulation of a succession of religions alongside Brahmanism, notably the arrival of Buddhism and Jainism as the two great reforming sects of ancient India, and then the latter-day arrival of Islam. All of these contributed to a diverse community, quick to share skills and accommodate the new. Gujarat has had a special place on the Indian littoral, looking outwards as much as inwards to the wider Arabian Sea and beyond, extending its interests from the Alexandrian Mediterranean all the way east to Indonesia and indeed to South China. So a very wide reach, and that's really what I want to paint a picture of today. Because I'm not primarily a textual person, I'm a material culture person. I'll do my presentation through objects where possible. And in many ways, we're textually deprived in much of the history of this region. The texts are limited and even more limited in what they discuss. And so there are whole dimensions of life that are not addressed from textual sources. But some of those gaps can be addressed through the surviving material culture, and that's partly what I want to do today. So the major centers, for those of you, I assume all of you are here, know roughly speaking, where Gujarat is, of course, in the northwestern bays of the Indian subcontinent. And I show the key places that I'll be touching on today. So Gujarat is at this point nestled in here, and with the major peninsula, the Kutch Peninsula, jutting out into the Arabian Sea. And then the major centers we'll be talking about center principally on Cambay, which was its historic port city from early medieval times onwards, linked on the Narmada River, which is the great river draining out of the central Deccan of northern India, really forming the geological boundary between North India and the Deccan, and then the Tapi River south of that. And those two estuaries play a very important role in ancient and medieval trade, and then, of course, after the 16th century, with the presence of the intrusion of European traders into the trading systems. So Cambay is a key port, Ahmedabad, which rose to prominence in the Islamic period in the 15th century, Patan, which is an ancient city and still pursues some of the arts associated with ancient India, very specialized textile productions, and so on. Petapur, Broch, and Surat, which became the successor state to Cambay in the 16th, 17th centuries, when Cambay appears to have silted up and be less navigable for larger vessels. So these are the key areas. Due over here, where the peninsula area where the earliest mosque was built in the 12th century in the Arabian model, not the Iranian model, Arabian Peninsula model with a projecting mihrab. This is not the earliest mosque in India. They appear on the southwest coast of India and the Malabar regions, which we know was engaged in trade in pre-Islamic times, of course. Indo-Roman trade, very active on the with Condon and Malabar coasts of Western India. But here, the Portuguese built one of their first forts on the Indian subcontinent, and it became a major center for Portuguese activity in this region. So I want to explore two aspects this afternoon of this multi-stranded social fabric that constitutes Gujarat historically and gives it its distinctive regional character. The first is the accommodation of Jainism and particularly the sect of Jainism, which was referred to as Svetambara Jainism. The Jains, very briefly, in demonstrable historical terms, was founded by a teacher in around the 5th century BCE, broadly contemporary with the Buddha, and in the same territory of Magadha, the ancient kingdom of eastern India. His teachings was one of the non-conformist groups, along with the Sakyamuni Buddha, who challenged traditional Brahmanism and led to these schisms, if you like, within traditional Brahman society. The Jains themselves, somewhat later, became factionalized over interpretation of the original teachings. So such a common issue as religions evolve. And they split into essentially two sects. The Svetambara, white-clad, those which were robed, who settled in the West, in Rajasthan and Gujarat principally, as a simplification, but it's broadly the historical picture as we understand it from around the 3rd century BCE. The second group, the Digambara, sky-clad, i.e. unclothed, naked, the renunciants, went south into the Deccan, and the great monumental remains from them are principally in Karnataka state in the south today. And on the screen is a wonderful Gujarati Jinnah, Nimanatha, from a kota, the kota called Nimbaroda, around 6th or 7th century AD. The evolution of Jain art is very much runs in parallel to that of Buddhism of the early centuries AD in terms of figurative sculpture, and it's a sort of false line of inquiry to say which came first. They were clearly running in tandem. They were clearly cross-fertilizing, exchanging ideas and so on, and imagery as well. In many cases, I think, images were introduced in the same workshops for both Jain communities and for Buddhist patrons as well. One of the defining features of Jainism and indeed Buddhism, which also came to Gujarat in this early period, in the early centuries BCE, is the shared interest in ascetic practices, which became a very, very important, an ancient tradition shared by all religious practitioners in early India. The ascetic engaged in forest retreats and removing themselves from the emotive and material life of a householder. I show you a sort of range of images on the screen which allude to this, the centrality of the tree, which is a recurring motif in the early narrative life of the Buddha. Almost every episode of the Buddha's life is directly linked and referenced to specific types of trees. This is not coincidental, and it relates to a presupposition about the importance of ascetics inhabiting forest retreats and places away from society, a disengagement. And then you get, of course, the famous Jain story of the two brothers who fought over in a succession feud, and the brother that was prevailing in the battle, seen on the right, withheld his sword, would not kill his brother, and became an ascetic. And this is the image of Bahubali. We see in a little diminutive bronze, and I show you a detail from a 12th century wooden manuscript cover to the left of that, painting of the same subject. These are diminutive images you could hold in one hand. The largest monumental rock-cut sculpture of the same subject in South India is something like 20 meters high and is celebrated on a 12-year cycle with a great abhishek, a great lustration ceremony, very, very important for Jains of the Digambara, sky-clad sect. We also have other parallels that appear between Buddhism and Jainism, for example. All of you know when the Buddha left the palace and his wife and his infant child departed on horseback to the forests, took his jeweled sword, cut off his hair. The tonsure ceremony, of course. In that act was symbolized his renunciation of his princely life and the beginnings of a life of inquiry as an ascetic. That's celebrated in Buddhist art, of course, with the veneration of the turban, the headdress understood to contain the severed hair being elevated up to the heavens, Indra's heaven, is seen here in this remarkable relief from around the 3rd century Common Era from Panagiri. It's a recently excavated piece, not yet exhibited. And on the left, we see the same practice effectively being pursued in a Jain context. The monk, the ascetic renunciant, is plucking out his own hair. It's painful business, no doubt, in the act of also renouncing material life, renouncing the life of a householder and pursuing the life of an ascetic prior to his final moksha. If you look at Jain miniature painting and Buddhist miniature painting of similar time frame, the lower image is a Eastern Indian parlor piece on palm leaf, but around the 11th, 12th century. It shows the Buddha of the past as the savior of mariners, the Dipankara Buddha, who was by this time in the form of Buddhism that had evolved, was venerated as a savior of travelers and especially those who ventured to sea. And above, the arrival of paper into India, which occurs around the 10th, 12th century, comes in with this early Muslims from West Asia, from Iran particularly, introducing paper, and the early manuscripts are produced in the Jain tradition right up until at least the 16th century, continue the format of the palm leaf. They're not the codex vertical book, they're the landscape that you would get in the palm leaf manuscript tradition. And they even leave a little interruption in the text to indicate where the hole would go for the binding cord to hold it all together. But it's just a sort of memory now, of course. It has no function anymore. But if you just detach from the subject matter and see, you can see the two works are clearly sharing the same set of underlying aesthetics and assumptions. So in a way, very revealing. Of course, texts were venerated in their own right. They were seen as potent. And we know quite a lot about the cult of the book in later Buddhism. We don't really know how early it begins, but it's certainly there in the mid-first millennium. And in the Jain tradition, we see here this little tripod stand that you're looking at. What's poised on the top of that is a paper manuscript with two wooden covers, polychromed, gilded, I think here, something and decoration placed on it. But that's the book that's being venerated. And I show you, actually, it's an early 20th century mural from Sri Lanka, which shows the writing on the palm leaf that takes place in the monastic context. Because both Jainism and Buddhism, as with Brahmanism, early Hinduism, were non-written traditions. They were oral. Wisdom and teachings were passed down through an oral tradition. And so the writing came much later. And in the Jain context, it's linked. This is no doubt stories generated many decades, generations later, as a way of preserving the oral tradition when it was in danger of being lost through famine or some social disruption. There was fear that the original word of the Mahavira, Jinnah, or the deed of the Buddha would not be preserved, would be lost. So writing down became important. But never did they let go of the oral tradition as well. So you go to a South Indian temple today and you'll see 8-year-old boys gathered for morning class for the oral instruction of the Vedas. And that's something they carry with them all their lives. These are typical Gujarati book covers from around the 11th, 12th century. This is really the beginning of surviving book forms as we know them. We have almost nothing comparable to this in the Hindu tradition. We have, the Buddhist one is thin on the ground because of the destruction of monasteries in the late 12th and 13th centuries. But in the Jain tradition, the Jains were enormously politic and devised ways of surviving, although they were always a minority religion and remain so today. They managed to make themselves indispensable to rulers, particularly in the management of finances. They moved into money management. We're talking first millennium here. So found themselves in the service and rising to high office under Hindu rulers and under Muslim rulers. And all they asked in return was that they were allowed to practice their faith without persecution. And so we have a whole range of temples which have come down to us and images which tell us that this was largely the case. There are instances of iconoclasm, of course. We have the Deccan, but broadly speaking, the Jains were very adept at riding the uncertainties of historical change. The cult of the book you can take back, and this is getting into slightly speculative territory, but I show you this image on the left, which is around 150, 200 AD from Mathura, North India, of a seated goddess, it's Saraswati, holding it. What she's holding in the upright item here in her hand is a palm leaf book. You can see the diagonal lines of the binding of the cord, which is used to hold it all together. Clearly, and this is and she is already clearly demonstrably the goddess of learning and wisdom, embodied personified in the text, if you like. So that is really a very early piece of evidence that we have from the material culture that we would otherwise not have awareness of. And this is how she evolves in the Jain tradition. She's Saraswati and another goddess, Ambika, two goddesses who are shared across the whole spectrum of all the early religions of India. And there was cross-fertilization. They simply repurposed them to their own ends. Buddhism came equally early to Western India. We don't know precisely how early, but we do have important inscriptions from the Emperor Ashoka in around middle of the 3rd century BCE. And Ashoka seems to have been very purposely famous, many of you will know, because in the Buddhist world, because he appears to have converted to Buddhism and pursued a Buddhist life and espoused Buddhist values and ethics in his later reign. But what he did leave us, which is quite extraordinary, is a very large corpus of rock-cut inscriptions, not in his heartland, but on the perimeters of the kingdom. So our understanding of the kingdom over which he ruled, the late Mauryan kingdom, the largest unified kingdom in India up to that point, with close diplomatic relations to the Parthians and West Asia, Mediterranean world, and so on. Very cosmopolitan world. Capital in what's today Patna, modern day Patna, Pataliputra. Around the perimeters of that are these rock-cut inscriptions, and they seem to be the frontiers of what we understand is the Mayan kingdom. And this is one of the famous ones. It's in Gujarat, showing the western limits of the expansion of the first great unifying kingdom in northern India. And then we have sites a little south of Gujarat. This is in northern Maharashtra, Sopara, a very important Buddhist complex. All again on the left, excuse the quality of the image, again a Ashokan inscription. And then later Satavahana coinage from around 1st, 2nd century AD, and reliquary contents from the heart of the stupa above. This was found in a series of Russian doll-like containers, one inside the other. The gold, this is the innermost container, the gold which would have had the actual relics. The hair, the tooth, the ash or bone, whatever the relic may have been, was in this little punch decoration gold container. Sopara is right on the coast. On the Kondon coast, this is the northern coast, which Gujarat dominates most of it. And we know was in active trading connections with the late Roman world, 1st, 3rd AD. There are recent, people have been working recently on papaya manuscript material of Alexandrian Roman documents, which were not new, but they've become digitized, University of Vienna principally. And that material has allowed people to virtually rewrite the early history of Indo-Roman trade. We now know that we have manifests, for example, of ships being loaded with different grades of ivory destined for the Mediterranean, and vessels serving the Roman trade. I'm not saying they're Roman ships, but they were ships in service of the Indo-Roman trade. So the picture is changing very rapidly. The importance of mariners was very important, is clear. And as I say, both these images show one of the Buddhas of the past as a protector of mariners. And the famous mural lower left at Ajanta, which mid-5th century, which shows a very typical trading ship of the period with amphora-type jars stacked on the decking and so on, triple mast, and the crew appealing for salvation in the midst of a storm. conjured up by the storm god. This is, and it has this, I'll come back to this a little later. This is a very particular importance in terms of our story today. So the Jains were permitted to build their great medieval temples. Interestingly, they do look rather fortress-like. You get a sense they could be defended quite effectively. These great plinths and so on, often walled with heavy fortification, and they contained within them, in addition to the image houses for the jinnahs, they contained the bandars, the strong room come library of those institutions, and that's where the manuscripts have survived so well for the best part of 800 to 1,000 years, and a very important tradition which ensured we have textual material, original manuscript material from the 10th, 12th century onwards. The interior of one of the great temples at Mount Abu, and one of the great Jinnah images in the Metz collection. So these are really the great renunciants. And of course, it all matters. I'm sorry our patrons are not here today supporting this lecture so generously, because this image really shows a couple venerating an which they almost certainly have been responsible for commissioning. So this establishes the relationship between the donor and the divine images that were installed for veneration and so on. And here we see a horse-headed yaksha figure under veneration, one of the subsidiary Jain deities. Now, this is a spectacular monument from the Chalukyan period. It's mid-11th century. It's a 7-story building, inverted, set into the earth, terraced at the bottom of royal baths for bathing, and with extraordinary, would have had timber flooring between the levels, light wells, no doubt, as well, to light to cast down to the water at certain times of the day. An extraordinary monument of Gujarati art produced near Patan, silted up and actually fully buried in sand when it was found, and meticulously excavated. I'm showing it today because much of the decoration of these shallow relief decorative paneling you see all around the different 7 terraces of the stepwell, and this is the design repertoire that exactly informs the textiles that we know were in circulation at this time and even earlier. We have radiocarbon 14 dated Gujarati textiles from the Red Sea and from Lower Egypt, from Fostat, at least to the 10th century, and some of it now pointing even earlier. So we have this is really quite remarkable that the relief sculptures in this 11th century royal commission, it was the queen of the Chalukyan king, King Bhima I, who commissioned this 20 years in construction. But they were clearly drawing on the full repertoire of designs that were in circulation at the time. It would have been in wood carving, it would have been in domestic architecture, palatial architecture, certainly. This is a piece of royal architecture, and then found its expression in the visual arts and in textile design. This is an example of a textile coming out of Egypt. From most of these samples from Fostat, which is today suburban Cairo, but was the former capital of Lower Egypt, was in the early medieval period. Most of these had served their final function, had been as burial shrouds for the Coptic and other communities, but their original functions were domestic, for attire, for interiors, and so on. Now, Ahmedabad, of course, is a major cultural hub of Gujarat today, but it's essentially a modern city, as you see it today, created in the mid-15th century. And much of it built, this is the Friday Mosque, much of it built on recycled material from Jain and Hindu temples. So this whole issue, which is very problematic and politicized, of the pillaging of sites to reusing materials, forcibly removing them for your own purposes, is something, a theme which is a recurring one in much of the history of South Asia. And so I show you the interior of the Juma Masjid, and on the right, this beautiful flowering tree relief and a blind window detail on the mosque itself. We'll come back to that a little later. So all of this activity is happening in this region here, from Cambay up to Patan, south to Broch and Surat. This becomes a real sort of heartland. It was also very important for gemstone trade, very important for textile production. The cotton was grown in the hinterland, in Malwa, in the interiors of the Deccan, transported to the coast. It was a big, organized, sophisticated production process. When the goods ventured abroad, the principal vessel used was the Arab dhow, produced on the Arabian Peninsula, and Yemen and Muscat, Oman were the original homes of Arab dhow production, as best we know. The Arabian Peninsula ran out of hardwoods sometime in antiquity. They sourced their timbers from the east coast of Africa and the west coast of India. The hardwoods were brought in, the ships were built on the beaches and put into service. Ibn Battuta, the great 13th century commentator, says that the best coconut fiber cord that you needed for stitching your boats, because these are a stitched construction, which means they flex in, they survive in storms. Whereas a rigid boat will break up, a dhow will ride the storm. They leak like a sieve, but they're actually they will survive a storm in the way a conventional boat, a rigid boat, will not. So they're probably the most ingenious boat ever built. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler in the 13th century, says, oh, and of course the best coconut fiber for stitching your boats came from the Maldives. So you can see how there was this trade in materials, hardwoods from East Africa, down towards Mozambique, Zanzibar, coconut fiber rope for stitching from the Maldives, dye stuffs and other materials coming from India. The circulation of materials is so well developed. These are the centers for boat building in Yemen, Oman, serving the Red Sea trade, of course. One particularly interesting place which has come onto people's radar relatively recently is Socotra, this small island here, rather desolate island, just before you enter the Gulf of Aden. And that was always known as a sort of, pirates, hangout, a desolate sort of place with no real much to recommend it. But what has been found recently is a whole series of inscriptions left by mariners who broke their journeys there and could take fresh water there and so on. And some of these go back, and some are Brahmi, very early centuries, Common Era inscriptions. And then there's a whole cluster of medieval Gujarati inscriptions, particularly 15th to 17th century inscriptions, which have been discovered in near the old port areas of Socotra. So all of this just builds a picture, I think, of how intense this trading system was. And of course, what they were trading in were the spices. Malabar, southwest India, is the home of black pepper, other important spices being sourced, cotton goods, of course, a key factor in all of this. And not forgetting the aromatics, which were so important in particularly in religious life. and the Buddhist demand for aromatics. Certainly by the Sung period in China, much of the maritime trade seems to have been driven by the growth in Buddhist temples and the demand for aromatics in those burning camphor, night and day, sandalwood and whatever, honoring the Buddha. So literally shiploads, coming in from Sumatra and wherever they could source it. And this reminds us of this painting from Ajanta from the 5th century. This isn't just a generic sailor. This is the merchant Purna. And the merchant Purna was the adopted son of sandalwood traders, according to the Buddhist legend, the Purna Avadana. And he, much skilled than his stepbrothers, he was put in charge of the family business, became a true connoisseur of sandalwood. And out of that connoisseurship, he made a fortune, built an enormous, great wealth by traveling abroad, risking seaward journeys, bringing back exotic and special camphors and sandalwoods to trade. And that wealth he gave to honor the Buddha. He built, so the legend tells us, a very special dedicated room for the Buddha, should he ever visit, the perfume room, which every monastery should have, a place in anticipation of a guest, even though the guest may never arrive, and that's the Buddha himself. And you have the perfume chamber where he could be received and kept fragrant, of course. And all these steps again in the Buddha's life, including his final cremation, are all linked to the use of perfumes and aromatics. So all sorts of flowers were thrown on the burning pyre when he was cremated and so on. These are very important sort of metaphor. And this is also the moment when we see the rise of these cults of the bodhisattvas as protectors against the perils of what canonized as the eight perils, the dangers of snake bite and I don't think they included domestic feud, but dangers of travel and so on. And one of the eight shown here at Kanheri, the cave complex just near Bombay, lower right is the detail. It's protection for mariners against storms at sea. And we have lots of ways of witnessing this. On the screen is a Tamil stele from the west coast of Sumatra, and from a place called Barros, which we know from earlier accounts was important for the sources of aromatics and resins, and particularly for alluvial gold coming out of the rivers of the interior of Sumatra. Sumatra and Kalimantan were two great sources of gold, probably the source of those mythical names that were given to ancient Southeast Asia, Savana Bhumi, Savana Dweepa, the land or the island of gold. And so this is a record of a merchant community. I mean, there are a guild, you had to be a member, pay up your dues, and if you were fully paid up, you were entitled to trade. And if you weren't, and this was the Jews were kept in trust as a pension fund for the families should the merchant die whilst sailing or whatever. So it was insurance policies for the families of the merchants. And if you don't pay your dues, you're forbidden from what they call stepping on the cloth, engaging in trade. To join a community, as we see in this painting from Tamil Nadu near Nagapattinam, they're sitting on a cloth and they're gem traders. They're exchanging the gemstones, little purses and the precious stones and so on. So this is very much the world in which we see Indian traders abroad. That's just the detail. You see the gemstones laid out here, the little cloth purse that would have contained either money or gemstones, and holding here between his hands is a wonderful spinel or ruby or something like that. So these become very important, I think, for understanding what's happening here. Horse traders. We know that the kingdom of Vijayanagar in the 15th and 16th century in the Deccan had relied heavily on cavalry, and they got most of their horses from West Asia, from the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. And the Arabs dominated that trade. The Portuguese also elbowed their way in so they could have a share of it as well. And here you see Muslim traders on an Arab dhow bringing horses in to South India. So this was a very important part of the commerce of this time. And then we come to sort of the European chapter, and a couple of sources, Duarte Barbosa, at the beginning of the 16th century. This is the time of Albuquerque establishing the Portuguese presence in Goa, and then the expansion that followed. Their goal, of course, was China, and the chain that they built, footholds through Malacca and Macau, Japan, and so on. So just to give you a sense of the scale of trade that went on, that many of these merchants were immensely wealthy. We have a remarkable biographical note from a 12th century merchant from Siraf, Persian Gulf, no, not 12th, 10th century merchant, who brought back from China enough silk cloth to make a complete cover for the Kaaba at Mecca. It's a very large structure, and a singular honor that someone alone could spend millions probably to pay for that as an act of piety. His tombstone has been found, and it's so modest, just a ramad or something, the ship owner and merchant or something. I mean, doesn't sing his praises in any real way. Very humble, but that was his gesture. So this trade, which really extended from Basra, which we all know from the shocking Iraq War, which was historically the capital. It was the port serving Baghdad in the medieval period, from Basra all the way to South China. We always assumed that was done in stages. But the reality is becoming clearer now from the shipwreck work that's going on, is that these Arab dhows, many of them are engaged in journeys which included that whole, that went all the way, and cargoes which were destined, being produced in South China, which were primarily intended to be offloaded in West Asia. So they would stay on the same vessel the whole journey. So this is really quite a remarkable new understanding we're getting from the shipwrecks. I want to concentrate now on the time remaining on this remarkable book, which is an account written by Tomé Pérez at the beginning of the 16th century in Malacca. He was an accountant or bookkeeper of some sort in the army, serving under Albuquerque, and after the conquest in 1511 and of Malacca, and stayed 3 years. And built and kept as meticulous observer. And it's an extraordinary account that he gives. And I just read to you here, Cambay chiefly stretches out her two arms, Cambay Gujarat. On the right, she stretches out towards Aden, Red Sea, and the other towards Malacca. Malacca cannot live without Cambay, nor Cambay without Malacca, if they are to be very rich and prosperous. The trade of Cambay is extensive and comprises cloths of many kinds, but of fair, meaning very good, quality. So the relationship is very clear, and the preeminence of textiles is very explicit in all of this as the major commodity. Malacca, this is a much later vision of Malacca as seen by the Dutch in the 17th century, but the key elements are still present from much earlier descriptions that we have. If we ignore the fortified area here in the Dutch Kirk here, which is all much later, 17th century, but the footbridge here, which had retailers, shops, as referred to, is in place already and still exists today. And then right along the waterfront, the go-downs of all the foreign merchants, where you would build mud brick or some slightly more substantial material storehouses for your cargoes, rather than just bamboo and thatch, because the perennial danger of fire, of course, destroy your stock. And Malacca represents a sort of new chapter because traditionally the early centers in Southeast Asia in particular were by their nature almost temporary. Timber, bamboo, rattan. If you needed to pack up and leave, you could. And take your things that are of value, and textiles were certainly a store of value. You invested in textiles, they were portable. You could carry that as your wealth, you took it with you, and you could abandon this. It'd be gone in 10 years, and you'd build somewhere else. This is why people have been looking for decades for Srivijaya, the great entrepot that was right on the equator that linked India to China. Talked about, from the very earliest sources in the early centuries Common Era. No one's ever found it. It's probably around Palembang on the Musi River, and it probably looked like this. And that's why you don't find it. They find lots of little precious objects in the riverbanks and the riverbed, but nothing substantive. A few brick structures upriver. This is the coast of Borneo in the late 19th century, Sambas, but it could be almost anywhere in that time frame. So most of the ships were the Arab dhows, as I mentioned. This is a wonderful 13th century manuscript illustration of a dhow in distress. Its main masts have been destroyed in the storm or something. And then typically you see here the crew using animal skin containers to bail out the water, scooping up the water, spilling it over the side. And the other little porthole windows are the presumably distressed merchants who were renting space on the ship, often small-time merchants who would rent space for their goods and themselves to travel from the Gulf to Western India. Perez tells us up to 30 varieties of cloth. All the cloths and things from Gujarat have trading value in Malacca, and the kingdoms which trade with Malacca. Important because Malacca was nothing in itself. It was just a nodal point of exchange. It didn't even grow its own rice. They had to import that from Java mostly, or southern Thailand. It was just in the right place, like good real estate. So they prospered because of the monsoon winds, and that the mariners had to stop at a certain point and wait for the winds to change direction. And that if that happens to be in your neighborhood, you've got a great opportunity. So that's how Srivijaya prospered. That's how Malacca, which really is the successor to Srivijaya, prospered, just as Singapore is the modern day successor to those other entrepot cities. Singapore doesn't even have water. It's all piped in from Malaysia. They're totally dependent on resources from elsewhere. So what's the key commodity? It's textiles. Gujarat is producing great textiles. On the screen on the upper section, early indigo dyed from Fostat, from Old Cairo, and below early, let's say, 14th century block printed. What you see, that entire design is one wooden block, large, probably as large as this podium, more or less, 2 by 3 feet. Large wooden block carved in relief, high relief for block printing. In this case, the mordants, that's the red color, which would receive the dye. And the blue above is a wax resist, batik, where the area is reserved in white would have been painted in a molten wax, and it's a reverse process. Beautiful little design. If you look for a moment, you'll detect the little geese rather cute, wide-eyed geese, the sacred Hamsa, the messenger of the Buddha, represented here in these designs. That's an Egyptian source piece, undoubtedly coming from Gujarat. This is how they were made, the common use of the what's called the kalam, Persian for pen, applicator for the mordants and so on, and a block cutter in a little town just outside outside Patel, making the carpentry caste tradesmen, hereditary, who specialize in making the wooden blocks for printing the textiles, printing the resists or the mordants. In some cases, we have other information. This piece from Indonesia, from where we have a sort of small fragment that's come out of the sands of Lower Egypt, perhaps a few inches square. Those textiles then get repeated, the same designs, in complete cloths that have come out of Indonesia. So you can see how the same design repertoire was serving both markets in these early, particularly in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So here we have this cloth. I would have thought it was a little earlier, but it has a chop which indicates that it was traded through Surat. So it's probably 16th or even early 17th century. We've told early on about the importance of war elephants in Gujarat, and we see here a nobleman, king probably, riding a war elephant, parading and so on. Spectacular, a very early image. And I show you on the right a famous the earliest illustrated Portuguese manuscript, which illustrates the life in Gujarat. We don't have a date for it, somewhere in the 16th century, now preserved in Rome, which gives a little verification of this importance of this subject. Same subject here with a fragment from Egypt on the right with elephants and equestrian soldiers. Fragment of a face of a woman, and you see on the right an Indonesian sourced example with these very distinctive profiles, the head in three-quarter view, the projecting eye. These are conventions we recognize from Jain painting, from the particularly Western Indian princely Jain, also Hindu manuscript art of the 14th and 15th centuries. These cloths are large. There's 4, sometimes 5 meters in length. And they're not of a type that you would use in India. They don't fit any specific dress code. They appear to be display items, regalia pieces, and appear to have been made expressly for the Southeast Asian market in the 14th and 15th century. This is what they're modeled on. This is a mid-15th century Jain cloth painting celebrating the coming of spring. And you can see the conventions for the trees, conventions for the figures and so on, which recur in the textiles as well. The textiles found their way into Indonesia very early, of course, and it's remarkable that they've survived in the tropics in the way they have. And I think the key lies in the fact that these became heirloom objects, usually of the community, and were preserved and only put in baskets in the rafters and in buildings where you all said it. Cooking and it was smoke-filled atmosphere. This seems to have been a way of protecting them and passed down through many centuries. Even there's a field photograph from Florence, Eastern Indonesia, taken in the 1990s, in which we see young Flores women wearing traditional Flores locally woven textile, sarong, skirts and so on, but their shoulder cloths are Gujarati Patola from Patan, and regarded as heirloom objects, community property. Of indeterminate age, but almost certainly 150 years old, something like that. This gives you the sort of legacy of this style. This is the Jain painting tradition. Here we see it in the painted textiles, and then and this is a bit of a leap, but you then see things like Central Javanese court painting. This is a detail from a hand scroll. You're familiar with the shadow puppets, the Weang Kulet. This is Weang Beber, which is a narrative hand scroll, which a very small number survives. This one's in Leiden. You'll notice the stylization of the figures and the projecting eye. So for my dollar, that's a continuation, an awareness of that convention has almost certainly come from Gujarat, transmitted via the textiles and then absorbed into local painting traditions. The origins, no doubt, completely forgotten. And then I think the tour de force of all this are the textiles depicting forested landscapes. Absolutely outrageous in their beauty, a whole range of types of trees, clearly differentiated, fruit-bearing and flowering trees, very, very beautiful. And we have fragments from Egypt, exactly the same thing. There's no doubt this is all part of a global trade the Gujaratis were promoting, details from painted manuscripts showing the same conventions. There's your mosque in Ahmedabad again with the flowering tree motif, which again you can see the common repertoire of design that's being shared. Portuguese and then the Dutch and of course then others intruding into the trading system. This is Bantan, which was the port on the western extremity of Java. It's the port that the Dutch took over and closed down asset strip, no doubt, in the process, and they created Batavia instead, which is a very bad choice because Batavia is swampy and malaria-ridden. But they wanted to monopolize the trade and exclude foreign Western powers and others. So this is a view of Bantan, various traders. The detail below is identified in the key as cloth traders. So they're all holding bundles of cloth offered for sale, such as Perez was describing at Malacca. And I couldn't resist putting in the little detail of this, of what looks like a charming little church or chapel, but you'll notice it has a crescent moon on the top. It's a mosque. And then this, of course, the mosque at Bantan is one of the original mosques of the foundation of Islam in Indonesia, and very important, and remains today. Very distinctive architecture. It certainly doesn't look like a 17th century country Dutch church as it's depicted here. Bantan, observed by a Scandinavian traveler, Arab trader, Javanese merchant, Chinese merchant, and that really sums it up in a way. And what are they doing? The Arab is looking at a ring. And the Javanese make beautiful gold rings set with seals and so on. And I show you one here, which we know came out of the riverbanks at Palembang, almost certainly Srivijaya, and happens to carry a Pallavi, that's Middle Iranian inscription, and witnessing that the Pallavi speaking or the Middle Iranian speakers of Iran, who continued to be active in trade after the Sasanian period, were active in Southeast Asia. This is one of two inscriptions that have come to light recently, the first evidence of the use of Pallavi script in Southeast Asia. And in both cases coming from maritime and riverine sites. The Gujaratis were incredibly enterprising, and there was an extraordinary phenomenon that occurred somewhere in the 13th to the early 15th century, which was a very active trade in tombstones, blank tombstones in many cases. Well, they'd be decorated, but they would leave out the critical details of who and when, and that'd be added, when necessary. And they were shipped all over. Arabian Peninsula, Aden, East Africa, Sumatra, North Coast, Aceh area, and North Coast Java. And this is one in Cambay, one of the original ones, as it were. There's a whole cenotaph with the tombstone. And the one on the wine drawing is the one from Gresik, which is North Coast Java, 15th century, dated 14 something, 1419, I think. Malik Ibrahim or something is the merchant, someone holding high position in what then was the Majapahit kingdom of Eastern Java. But importing their tombstones from Gujarat, so that it has all the right texts being quoted, from Quranic texts being quoted on the tombstone, and the right extracts, and then their personal details. In some cases, there are some which have been found with a blank left for the details to be added locally, and in some other cases, it's thought that they were fully manufactured to order. So the ships would go back with the order after someone had died, within a 12-month turnaround, if they could produce them in 4 or 5 months, then they could come back on the return sailing and be delivered within 1 year. So it was a fairly efficient system, but a highly organized one. Portuguese came in with their big carracks, their black ships, gunships essentially, and created a whole lot of trouble all along the coast of India and elsewhere. Built their forts at various places, commissioned things for the Lisbon market, textiles, mother of pearl objects, which Gujaratis are very adaptable, producing new things on demand. This mother of pearl tradition, it has a local tradition, but they then adapted it to European forms and so on. A marriage scene from this 16th century manuscript in Rome, just to show the sort of textile designs. They're rather generic, shall we say, stripes and checks, okay? Doesn't tell us a great deal. And then a scene which is identified in Portuguese as being a scene of single Indian women meeting a Portuguese man, as in some romantic encounter or marriage proposal or whatever. And of course, in the 16th century, there was a lot of intermarriage. Unlike in later periods when there was far more segregation between the foreigners and the indigenous. This is a famous textile from the Brooklyn Museum, 16th century, which shows Portuguese and his local family in the south in Coromandel Coast. But I want to conclude with this remarkable painting, a series of paintings produced as part of the beatification process for Francis Xavier. His exploits from going out to Portuguese Goa, and then the miracles that he performed through Asia before his death on an island off the coast of China. So he was beatified very quickly after his death, and a series of 24 small panel paintings were produced depicting all the miracles, which were installed in a chapel. You can see them today in Lisbon, at São Roque, which is the headquarters for the Jesuits in Lisbon. It was in the 16th century. When I saw these for the first time, a whole lot of things just fell into place, because all the figures are wearing rather colourful textiles, as you can see. But unlike almost every other depiction of indigenous textiles, these are very specific. And I said, wait a minute, I know that textile design. There it is from Sumatra, from part of the Indian trade east. There it is again, that step square pattern. There it is again, in combination of the red and blues. Again, there's floral repeats. We get this pattern in Japanese screens, dateable to early 17th century. Here it is in a waistskirt for this woman. It's exactly the same pattern. So these can't be coincidental. So the paintings were produced by an artist, Portuguese artist, Renoso. We know his biography. He never went east. He must have been sent actual cloths through the Jesuit network. You can't invent these designs. They're not just stripes and checks. So he must have had those to work to produce his paintings, which raises up a whole new, level of interest in this. And then finally, with the Dutch, Jan Peter Cohen was the first Director General of the Dutch East India Company in Batavia, and he said it all really in this statement about the whole interconnectedness of Asian trade, that the Dutch didn't make a lot of money trading to Europe. They had occasionally had bonanzas, a good successful Amsterdam auction, but most of their money was made interregional trade in Asia, linking up, taking goods to Japan and bringing back silver, taking ceramics from Vietnam up to Korea and Japan, based on wooden models that had been sent from those countries. I mean, the whole system of commissioning that was going on, and the Dutch plugged into that, and that's how they prospered for 200 years. They produced great maps. And you can see all these red places around the coasts. These are all toeholds that the Dutch have on the Indian coastline. It's quite staggering, many of which had proper factories or forts, but at least there was a presence. And of course, North Sumatra is very important, the Straits of Malacca, and then you're heading South China Sea. And finally, the Patolas, of course, these are the grand textiles of Patan, the double ikkats, when you pre-bind the threads in both directions. It's a little mind-blowing, and produce these wonderful geometricized patterns. These are elite textiles, and of the highest order. And again, they produced a whole range of these, which are quite distinct from those used domestically in Gujarat and elsewhere in India, done, it would seem, to Indonesian taste. And we witness this even, this is a photograph from the 1920s of the Crown Prince at Solo, one of the two royal houses of Java. And they choose as the backdrop for this photograph in a Gujarati Patola, not a batik, but a Gujarati import, the tiger and elephant cloth. So it gives you a sense of the status. There's extraordinary, one of these large ceremonial overskirts that Javanese nobility wear, the so-called dodot, double-size sarong, if you like, which you wear over your ordinary sarong. And it's a patchwork, it's a catalogue of really an inventory of trade textile patterns, all in this patchwork, simulated patchwork effect. And patchwork is what you see here. This is real patchwork. So this is the Sultan of Yogyakarta, Hamengkubuwana the second, I think, and wearing an elaborate jacket, a patchwork, a talismanic protective jacket, with a great overskirt, as you can see, a batik design, but look close at his trousers. And of course, they're Patola, as we see here. So that really brings to a conclusion Gujarat's lasting legacy in Asian trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So,
Oh, the mic seems to have walked. Oh, it's coming back to you.
thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. What we have here is Gujarat, which is on the side, literally on the periphery, in terms of maps in India. And yet it becomes the gateway to India for people from the east and the west because of the port cities. And it's interesting that in a reverse way, the Gujaratis are the ways in which many people in the west get to know about India because they are the face of India in this country. So Gujarat has been both the gateway on the one hand, as well as the center for so many different ways of thinking about globalization. And we think globalization happened yesterday. But I really admire the way in which you started off with talking about Gujarat as being a cradle of multiple cultures, particularly emphasizing the Jain, but showing the connections with Buddhist thought and Hindu thought. And then went on to speak about how this becomes the place where the East and the West meet. It seems to be like the New York Stock Exchange at that point, and how the goods from there go from to all over the world, and particularly we have the textiles. And I love the quote about how you can change the stuff from Gujarat into X, into Y, and parlay it eventually into gold. And I mean, talk about entrepreneurship and the value of the goods from Gujarat.
Absolutely.
And woven into this is sculptures like the Rani Ki Vav and so on. So incredible art in multiple forms from India, from Gujarat itself. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And as I was hearing this, it was almost like listening to the history of art in Gujarat. And I was thinking about the way in which Professor Roy Craven, and we have the honor of having his daughter here with us today, Hilary Craven, how Professor Roy Craven introduced the whole world to the art of India through his foundational book.
Absolutely.
So it's a particular pleasure for me that you're here to give the Roy Craven lecture today. So we have time for a few questions, just a couple. If anyone has any questions. John?
Thanks. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. So my understanding with the Greeks, do you have anything to say about the Greeks? They seem to come in through the land mainly into a bit north of Gujarat, and we know something about them from like early Buddhist Pali texts, like this conversation between King Milinda, Greek king, one of Alexander the Great's leave-behinds in northern India. That peninsula area and that whole waterway, is there any evidence that the Greeks were coming over through the Arabian Sea and landing in those areas, or were they strictly, in your opinion, a land-based?
I think that both things happened. You're referring to the Gandhari material and so on coming out of the northwest, yeah. I mean, that's obviously one of the hotbeds of generating new texts in early Buddhism. Like all throughout the history of early monastic Buddhism, they were strategically located on trade routes from whence they got their patronage and support and so on. So that region, yes, you take it right back to Alexander the Great, of course. Those early invasions when he got right to the cusp of northwest India and to the Indus, and that's the legacy of that, both in terms of settlement, people who stayed from his armies didn't go back, and then that populations replenished through the generations through trade connections and so on, and links with a whole succession of different dynasties and clan groups that dominated those interior lands, including, the Kushanas in later times. So they're important. But both in places like Bagram in Afghanistan, which has yielded such extraordinary riches of ivory and other carved luxury goods, were clearly part of a bigger phenomenon, a wider picture. So land travel was important, and those land routes played a role. But I think there's plentiful evidence that the maritime routes were also very important, and from an early time. It may not have been open sea navigation at first, and we may have been hugging the coastlines in the early times, which is a more dangerous path to take. But they nonetheless what you can carry on in a boat as opposed to what you can carry on a camel means there's enormous commercial incentive to go by sea. And this is why, at the end of the day, the Central Asian Silk Route had real commercial limitations because you couldn't carry volume and weight by pack mules and camels. You have a decent-sized ship, you can carry tons of cargo. And both carry risks. So I think both things are true, if I'm not giving you an evasive answer. Please.
Do you think this maritime, whether it's kind of a coast hugging or some kind of open sea travel, do you think that happened around with the Greeks, happened around the time of Alexander the Great as well? When do you think, what's your understanding of when this begins and what's the kind of window of time?
I mean, the sources we have, both written and archaeological, are not that ancient. I mean, they'll take us back to the beginning of the first millennium in terms of Roman sources and the archaeology that goes with it. The Red Sea excavations, Bianche and other places, Cosa El Kadim. These are the Roman era ports on the Red Sea that were serving the Egyptian trade. Did it exist before that? Almost certainly, yes. Ashoka's father, the great Mauryan emperor, clear links, to the Parthian world, and most of those were almost certainly conducted over land. But you have the early ports that existed at the estuary of the Indus, which were clearly part of this same network, so there's we can sort of try and piece together. I mean, for the later historic periods, the archaeological picture is quite clear. It's marked by certain types of objects, both Persian Gulf ceramics mainly and Chinese ceramics from the other direction, which are markers all the way along, Abbasid coinage all the way along. You can sort of, the footprints are there very clearly. The early periods, it's difficult, and particularly in my mind, the premier commodities even in the ancient world was cloth. Textiles were a great store of value, prestige objects. You wore, you displayed, the best you could afford. The status markers. So, but of course they don't. They're the least likely to survive of all archaeological material. So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions.
Any other questions from the audience? I have a couple. I was trying to hold myself here.
Why am I not surprised?
You showed us very clearly how some artistic features from Gujarat, the eyes and so on, made its way into the artistic repertoire in Indonesia. Is there any such movement to the West? That's one question. Any possible trace that you see? And the second thing is, and this is even more hard to trace than textiles, we spoke about salt and pepper and the spices, but one of the things that historians of food have shown is that a lot of stuff that we identify with Indian food today really came from other places, and Indian food also went to different other places. And of course, the staples of Indian cooking today, like pepper and potatoes and so on, everything came from the New World.
Right.
So, is there any evidence of food travel that you have seen come across in your work? It's a little off your area, but I thought I'll put it out there.
Right. In terms of the first question, the reciprocal influence back in coming from these source countries, or do you mean to West Asia?
Yes.
Or to West Asia, okay. That's less easy to pinpoint because the textiles being produced in Lower Egypt are part of a very ancient continuum reaching back to Egyptian times, and continue and absorb a whole range of. It's a region very much marked by conquest and reconquest. Each time that happens, new cultural strains get added to the mix. So it's not so easy to disentangle all of that and point fingers like you can in Central Java, for example. The important on the second part of the question to do with taste and spices and so on. I mean, yes, we know the Romans were, wanted two things from India. They want the very best muslins for the women to wear in Rome, and the commentators complained how expensive they were, draining the treasuries of Rome to pay for this expensive textile. And they wanted pepper as preservative and also as to improve the food you're eating. So they were sort of major items, and it goes back a very long way. I mean, and it's of course the whole spice trade extended all the way deeply into Europe. So you have the the British monk Bede, who's buried at Durham in Durham Cathedral, 7th century, is it? And the inventory of the things he left behind as a humble monk included several ounces of pepper. Now, the general view is that you could almost write equals gold in terms of value. This was highly prized, and these goods were circulating. So the archives at Fustad, there's an extraordinary archive I didn't go into today at Fustad, preserved in a synagogue in Fustad, and it has a special room, which I'm told is common to certain types of mosques, types of synagogues, the Genazi room, which houses documents. The written word should not be destroyed, the word of God. And so all sorts of documents, it's sort of like a letterbox. They were just thrown in there over the centuries. And it includes, and this was opened 100 years ago and collections dispersed around the world and has been a subject of intense study by a whole range of scholars, most prominently by Gottheim. And one of the mostly commercial transactions, or promissory notes, I'll lend you this money and you better come back in 12 months with some goods, please. And there's risk involved, of course, of trust and of danger. Someone trading in cloves and mace, which can only come from the eastern Indonesia, from the Malacca Islands, the only place. That's where Magellan was heading. Being traded in Palestine, Syria, in the 10th century. So these things were circulating and it was represented very high value. But none of them survive archaeologically because they're organic and they're gone. Yes, the spices associated with food were very important.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So on behalf of Chitra, I'd like to thank John Guy. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and to the Harn specially for hosting this event. Again, our gratitude to the doctors Kiran and Pallavi Patel Endowed Lecture Fund and to the Roy Craven Jr. Fund for making this lecture possible. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.